So thank you everyone for being here. I'm Stephanie Stuckey. I am Director of Sustainability Services for Southface Institute. And I want to make sure I recognize Sanjay Patel, who has been my partner in putting this together, along with the Southface staff and the Atlanta City Design Studio staff. So if you help put this event together, just raise your hand real quickly so we can give you applause. Thank you. I think others are out front. So just briefly, I wanted to introduce the two organizations that are benefiting from this. So if you purchased a ticket today, thank you very much. Your ticket is supporting the work that we do. So you're here at Southface, and for over 40 years, Southface has been a leader in the research, design, and implementation of a regenerative economy for the Southeast. We are a group of almost 55 technical and policy experts creating sustainable homes and workplaces with outcomes that lead to vibrant, healthy communities for all. And the other organization we're benefiting is Soccer in the Street, that is transforming lives and communities through the beautiful game. I love that. That was on your website. Founded in 1989 in Atlanta, they develop young leaders so they can lead rich lives and cultivate healthy communities through sports-based programming. They are gaining worldwide recognition for their Soccer Station initiative, which builds soccer fields and community classrooms in and around metro transit hubs. And I think the mission for both of our organizations fits so nicely with the Palaces for the People book and Eric Klinenberg's work. And I will just say really briefly how this all came about is that Sanjay and I ran into each other at a soil festival back in the summer, and I was reading the book, and the book talks about the value of public soccer. And I said, Sanjay, this is the best book, you've got to read it. And he's like, oh, Palaces for the People. Not only have I read it, but I have emailed the author, and we've had this great email exchange, and he's heard about my work and our work at Soccer in the Streets. And hey, if he ever comes to Atlanta, we need to get him for an event. And then we said, oh, and Tim Keane would be perfect to lead the discussion. So that's how this all came about. And several months later, I get an email from Sanjay saying, Eric Klinenberg's gonna be in town, and here we are. So I just cannot thank you enough for making time in your schedule to be here with us. And if y'all wanna come on up, I will introduce our two speakers. First is Tim Keane, who was appointed Commissioner of Planning and Community Development by Mayor Christine Reed on July 1st, 2015. Tim is responsible for design, permitting, zoning, preservation, housing, community development, and transportation planning in the city. Prior to his appointment, Tim was Director of Planning, Preservation, and Sustainability for the city of Charleston, South Carolina for 11 years. During that time, Tim worked for Mayor Joseph Riley on all matters relating to planning, urban design, preservation, and economic development. He was also the first planning director for the city of Davidson, North Carolina. He has a bachelor's degree in planning and a master's degree in architecture from the University of North Carolina in Charlotte, and was a Knight Fellow at the University of Miami School of Architecture. And our author, Eric Klinenberg, is the Helen Gould Shepard Professor of Social Science and Director of the Institute for Public Knowledge at New York University. He's the author of several books, including the one we're discussing today, Palaces for the People, How Social Infrastructure Can Help Fight Inequality, Polarization, and the Decline of Civic Life, Going Solo, The Extraordinary Rise and Surprising Appeal of Living Alone, Fighting for Air, The Battle to Control America's Media. And in addition, he's the editor of Cultural Production in a Digital Age, co-editor of Anti-Democracy in America, and co-author, and I'm reading this book right now, so I highly recommend it, Modern Romance with Aziz Ansari. He has contributed to The New Yorker, The New York Times Magazine, Rolling Stone, and This American Life. So without further delay, I'm sorry we don't have a fireside for this fireside chat, so you're just gonna have to imagine that we have one. It's much more sustainable not to have a fire, so I'll just put that out there. So let's give a warm welcome to our two speakers.
That's such a nice introduction. And I got nervous when you stood up. I thought it was going to be like one of those presidential debates where we would like circle around each other. Intimidate the other.
We could do that.
Such a friendly place for one of those.
This is actually my third fireside chat, and I've yet to see a fire. This is an amazingly sustainable city. We really care about these things. So where to start? I guess, and we'll open up to questions probably fairly quickly, but one thing I wanted to ask you about related to this topic, which I'm guessing most everyone here understands a little bit about, has to do with, I was reading actually Pete Buttigieg's review of the book in the New York Times, and he was talking about the matter of quality and not just quantity. And the reason I bring that up is it very much relates to the design of our places and our spaces. And I think that aspect of things is undervalued at times. And I wonder if you could speak about that, because it's about these places that allow people to thrive and have a community and all those kinds of things, but that there is an aspect to it which is you have to do it well, you have to do it right.
It's such an important point, so I want to answer that right away, but I really quickly want to make sure that I say thank you to Stephanie and also to Sanjay. It's really true that you guys emailed me right away. Sanjay is totally on it. If you've ever had to work with Sanjay or got a chance to work without Sanjay, that guy can organize anything. When the World Cup comes to Atlanta, it'll be because Sanjay got the finals here, away from New York and LA. I'm waiting for that to happen. So it's been really great, and I appreciate you coming here during lunchtime. You're referring to this book review from this Mayor Pete Buttigieg, this guy. So just to give you a sense of kind of how the world has changed, my book came out last September, and very quickly the New York Times book review had this long review essay by this no-name, possible pronounced name, mayor from South Bend, Indiana. And I was like really annoyed because nobody knew who this guy was. And I thought, couldn't they have at least, signed my book review to some author who people have heard of? This random anonymous guy. Who is this guy? Then, of course, like 3 months later, he's the future of American politics. So I'm somewhat ashamed about my response. Exactly. I'm proudly proclaiming that Mayor Pete reviewed the book. But so your questions about the significance of beautiful design, and I think this is clearly something that we recognize in many parts of our life. I mean, is there anybody in the room today who's not carrying an Apple device with them? Where like our world has been one man who's not carrying an Apple device. And that's amazing. I mean, the extent to which we're seeing people in the private sector realize that if they design things beautifully and make things that are user-friendly and attractive, not just user-friendly, but that pull us towards them, that we're going to want to be with those products. That's a lesson that I think people who build cities once took really seriously, and that we lost sight of as we moved into. It's so good when the organizer has that happen because it takes the pressure off everybody else. No, it's all good. It's all good. She's fine. Check in on her. It's all good. So I think we once recognized the power of beautiful design, and then I think we went through this vast expansion of American urban centers, and the goal was efficiency and scale, and we had to produce a lot of highways and a lot of housing. And we did it on the cheap, and we did it without regard to aesthetics. And then, so I grew up in Chicago. I'm from downtown Chicago, and I grew up in Chicago in the 70s and 80s. And one of the lessons that I have from that city is that, they actually built a lot of public parks, libraries, schools, even public housing. That was not the highest quality housing that was ever built, but was beautiful in its own right when it opened. And the failure there was also, it's not just the design failure, but the failure to invest in maintenance, which is not sexy, but which really matters. If you build places and you don't maintain them, they fall apart very quickly. That's something I saw in the 70s and 80s. And then the third thing is programming. So I really think it's those three things together. It's the design, and the quality of the initial thing. It's the maintenance. You know, are you continuing to invest in it, even though it's not going to win you points? You know, you're going to get a lot of glory if you come up with a new park or a new facility. You get very little glory in politics if you maintain something. And then programming, I think, is this kind of unappreciated feature of what makes a public place work well. And something I really came to appreciate given the amount of time I spent in libraries, which are awesomely programmed, you know, by these magical people we call librarians. But, you know, even just talking to Sanjay and visiting the soccer in the streets and the stations fields, you know, if you just build a soccer field, one thing happens. But if you build a soccer field and you program it, and you have staff, and you have local participation, and you set up leagues and clinics and things like that, you create a world.
You know, one thing regarding station soccer, when Sanjay came to us about it, the thing that made a lot of sense for the city to be a partner in it is the fact that there are many reasons, but one of them was that, yes, it's about soccer, but it's really about why we have transit, for instance, or why we make any kind of investments. It's to create a place that makes people safer and happier and, you know, and makes them not want to leave, you know, and I think station soccer is the best example I know of this anywhere, where you're beyond the soccer, you're making a place like that. And in a community that's used to these stations being very hard, cold, in some cases unsafe, places that you want to get through as fast as you can, that they're places that begin to be the centers of things. And I say that to kind of ask a question or get your observations around, as someone that works for government. And we see this now that this community is about to make a big investment in public transportation. And I can tell you that usually the people that are involved in these government investments don't think of themselves as responsible for these things. They're only responsible for the hard infrastructure. And what that hard infrastructure results in terms of the community is outside their scope. You know, that's not. And so what do you say to that? Or maybe you have something optimistic perhaps to say about experiences in other places.
I'd at least like to get you to a happier place in this discussion here. So what I'll say is that, you know, my book is about what I call social infrastructure. And that's a new concept. You know, I don't expect you to come into the room knowing about social infrastructure, but the argument in the book is that just as we have a kind of a material hard infrastructure for transit, for water, for power, for communications, so too is our social life dependent on an infrastructure, right? So if you don't socialize with people, you don't spend time with people around you simply because you value companionship, a lot of us value companionship, your capacity to spend time with other people in a way that feels good, in a way that's compelling, is largely determined by what's in the environment for you, by whether you live in a place that's invested in that social infrastructure. So, you know, I've got kids now, and I know that, you know, if I'm living in a place that's within walking distance of a good playground, a good public playground that's designed well, that's maintained, it's programmed, I have a place where I can walk and find a bunch of people who are in my situation too. My kids can also. They build relationships. I find other people who, you know, can watch my kids when I have to take a phone call, or who can hang out if we want to go have a social experience together. I don't wake up in the morning saying, like, what I really want is to build community today. You know, there are some people like that. I find them usually a little weird. Most people, you know, build their communities in the context of doing things that they like to do. Mm-hmm. And the way that you do things that you like to do is you live in a place that's got an investment in social infrastructure. And there are a variety of social infrastructure out there that, you know, playgrounds of a certain kind. I read in the book a lot about libraries. But public transit can be more or less of a social infrastructure, right? So you can build a transit system that is designed to be antisocial. Like if we have a transit system that's organized around the private automobile, we were essentially building a kind of antisocial infrastructure. It can facilitate the movement of people to places where they can get into social life elsewhere. But basically, like the story of Los Angeles, and I think too much of Atlanta is like this too, is kind of like a war of all against all, right? Remember road rage? Road rage is, like you're trapped in your car, you're by yourself. There's these other cars that are, zinging around you, and you have no way to communicate with the people around you except for to honk your horn. And that's not effective, so you get this pent-up anger. Like, think about the physical experience of being in a car where you're in congestion and people are cutting you off. That's a horrible experience. You come to not like being in your city. Or like, I live in New York City, and has anyone been to New York City recently and tried to be on the subway system there? Like, we used to have this amazing subway system in New York, And honestly, like if you're ever in New York on a good day and you go down into this Union Square station and you jump on the 4 or 5 train, and you don't have to wait very long, and then it just kind of flies through the city, underneath, and 5 minutes later you get off and you're on 86th Street, and you're high-fiving everybody around you on the train because you're so happy you live in New York and it's so easy and amazing. That doesn't happen anymore. Now what happens is you go down and we neglected our transit system. We literally haven't paid for the maintenance. We haven't updated the system. So you go down to the train, you wait a really long time. People are shoving up against each other. The train stops. It's 40 minutes later, you're in this fight, and you get out of the train station at 86th Street, and you're like, I should move to Westchester. I'm tired of this experience. And I think that's a failure of our transit planners to think not only about how to make a good transit system, but how much the transit system matters as a social infrastructure. And so in Atlanta, like when I drove around and saw possibilities for what you could do underneath those train stations and with the public transit system, and then I saw it realized with these little soccer parks. You see, there's actually so much possibility here, right? I mean, this is honestly, this is one of the most brilliant ideas I've seen for how you take a hard infrastructure that was designed for one thing and use it to supercharge your social infrastructure and build bridges. And the fact that, you're right that I write about soccer and sports generally in the book, because one of the things I've observed living in very divided cities, I grew up in Chicago, I lived in Northern California for a while, in Oakland, now I live in New York, these are all very divided cities, is shared spaces like libraries and athletic fields, soccer, basketball. They're among the few places that can actually bring different kinds of people together to build relationships around things that don't have to do with their identity. And so they have this kind of extraordinary capacity to get people engaged in common activities where relationships develop regardless of our divisions. And yeah, the divisions that we have matter later and they affect us. It's not like, it doesn't matter what, your race is when you're playing basketball or soccer. But we find ways of engaging each other really differently when we're in those spaces. I think there are enormous possibilities for them. So I think that this kind of activation you're doing in public transit here is really important. I expect it to become a model. But then also I think you face this next set of questions, which is like, all right, how do we make the public transit system itself more accessible to people in Atlanta? And that's both about where there are stations, who has access to the system and who doesn't. And I think there's also financial issues with access. Like my children are allowed to take public transit for free 3 times a day because they're New York City school kids. Does Atlanta have a system where school children can take public transit for free? If not, what are the costs to your city? Because they have to make that payment, right? What does it cost the city of Atlanta to charge people to use a system that they need? What does it cost you in terms of pollution? What does it cost you in terms of bridges that aren't being built? Social bridges? What does it cost in terms of the kids and their sense of being able to learn how to be citizens and part of the community? I think those are really big questions, and one that, if Atlanta's not doing that, it's not the only one. We're way behind the world on this in the United States.
I guess one of my main point on this topic is, I think that this is all for all of us in the room, that we have to think of the product of our investment, the reason for our investment as being the one that's described in this book. It's not the infrastructure. I mean, that's the way we think and we work, is we've got to build this thing, and I'm going to build this thing. And what it results in is that's not in I'm not responsible for that. Well, that's ridiculous. That's what matters. That's why we're doing that. And I think it's why it's a real critique of Atlanta's existence that you built it, and what did you get? What do you say to a city like, this is my impression of Atlanta, that Atlanta is a city that thinks, well, we have this, and this is what we're always gonna have, so there you go. You know? I mean, in terms of this incredibly difficult public realm, what do you say to a city that has that kind of
What I say
complex?
So what I say to cities like that, and Chicago's a city that's a little bit like that too, like, you know, it's self-satisfied in some ways. It's like, this is who we are. And I think anybody in this moment in our history who says, we have this is who we are, is deluding themselves. Because at this moment, there's nothing we should be taking for granted. You know? And I mean nothing. Like our relationship to the climate system, the ecological systems that have sustained human life in the way that we've known it for thousands of years, we cannot take that for granted, you know? I don't know that Miami exists, 30 years from now. I don't know that Manhattan exists 100 years from now. Houston, New Orleans, I don't know what's going on in Atlanta, but like our relationship to the land around us is changing so dramatically and at a pace that I think few people have failed to recognize. That if you just say, we're just gonna do business as usual, soon you're gonna be doing that underwater. And that doesn't make sense. I think we can't take for granted that we live in an open society that has strong democratic institutions and values, diversity and education and reason in the way that I totally took that for granted. And I can see a world in which like 5 years from now, 10 years from now, core institutions are eviscerated. That's why I read so much about the library in this book, by the way. I think of, when I try to come up with a feature of social infrastructure, right? These physical places that shape our interactions. The library as an institution embodies so many of the things that I think we treasure most and we value most, that are most essential to us as members of an open society and as participants in the democratic culture. I mean, it's such a funny idea. Like, if you close your eyes for a second and like imagine that the library did not exist as an institution. Imagine there's no such thing as a library. We don't have them, okay? And I came to Atlanta today, and we were talking about, the infrastructure and what it's all for, and society, and cities, and this is who we are. And I said, I've got this new thing I want to propose to you called the library. And here's what we're going to do. We're going to have these buildings, and we're going to put them in every neighborhood of every city, in every municipality, in every suburb and small town in all of Georgia. And we're going to have them open 5, 6, 7 days a week. And we're going to fill them up with books and periodicals, videos, technology, right? We're going to have lots of programming. We're going to staff them with like public employees called librarians. We're going to make them open and welcoming to everyone, regardless of their age, their race, their ethnicity, their social class, even their citizenship status. In fact, if people aren't citizens, we're going to especially welcome them in here. And we're going to teach them how to learn to speak English. We're going to teach them how to be citizens, right? And if I told you all this, and then I said like, oh, also everything in this library is going to be free, and we're going to give it away on an honor code, how many people in this room think that if the library didn't already exist, we would go for that idea?
Yeah.
In politics today.
Oh.
Is there anybody who thinks we have a chance in hell of that? I don't care how progressive your mayor or governor or anyone is. That idea that I just gave you is the most radical idea that's ever been stated in this room. I bet, right? This concept of like, that thing is radical. And by the way, in terms of change, and are we always like this? That idea didn't exist all that long ago. That's a newish idea. That's a 20th century idea for what an American library could be like, And there's only one reason that we have that. The most radical thing that I could possibly conceive of and pitch to you today already exists. And that's crazy. Like, it doesn't exist in a lot of other countries. And it exists because people who came before us built up an idea that there's something called the public good. And that it's worth not just investing in the idea, but also investing in the institution, building, putting taxpayer money into it, changing society for it. Because the idea was like, if you have public goods and you support them, you actually, even if you're paying for it with your tax dollars, you're creating a better city, you're creating a better society, because you're creating a world where other people have a chance and other people have some hope. and there's a place where we can go together and see ourselves, right? Recognize ourselves, do something for each other, because you want to live in a world where mobility is possible, where sustainability is possible, right? And once upon a time, we did all that stuff. And I bet there's not a single person in this room who believes that we're now doing the right set of things for the people who are coming after us. Right? We've inherited this incredible legacy because people before us believed in public goods and paid for it. What are we giving to the people who come after us? Oh, and so on this, like, we're Atlanta, we've always been Atlanta. Nobody gets to always be what they've been anymore. You know, that's over. It's over. We're in a crisis right now. We have a crisis in democracy, we have a crisis in climate, and we maybe have a crisis in governance more generally. And it's up to, I mean, so the terrifying thing about this moment, and it really is terrifying, is that 5 years from now, we could be like, oh, remember 2019, things were so good then. We were so calm, everything seemed so ordered, and we're like, honestly, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, we could be looking back at this era as like, all that stuff we took for granted, right? Things could get way worse, really fast. But also, this could be the moment, and it kind of feels on a lot of days like it is gonna be the moment, when we're going to say, we don't have to be that Atlanta anymore, we're gonna do something better. And there are a lot of incredible ideas about how to do things better right now. There's models for how to do things better right now. Like the station soccer is a model, right? The new libraries that you see going up, are models. There's new parks that you see that are models. There's sustainability initiatives that are models. There's a building that's, zero energy building. It's a model. The best cases are out there, and it's kind of up to us to get all in on them. And it means if you're already on board, are you talking about it? Are you telling people? Are you, when your, city planning commissioner or mayor does the right thing, are you making sure that they know that they're supported and appreciated, Because now, we're looking for models, and we need a story that works. And honestly, we're both unlucky because we're living through this stuff right now, but we're also incredibly lucky because we are the people at this moment in history who are going to decide our future.
Just to clarify one thing about my statement regarding Atlanta. Let me walk that back just a step. No, what I meant about that was that Atlanta has invested so heavily in highways. I mean, as I always say, we've got really, really big highways, we got medium-sized highways, we got little highways, we got every size highway you can have, because that's what the city we spent the last generation creating, which is one that isolates people into private realms. You must go from private realm to private realm on the highway in your car, and that's the way we will live as a community. And that's where I think Atlanta doesn't always have to be that way, where we can say, that was an interesting thing to do, now let's do something different. We can actually learn as a city and change. But I want to speak on a different topic, which relates to where you were headed there. And this has to do with the democracy side of things and kind of common good and people. I've been reading some about Frederick Law Olmstead recently, which is fascinating to me. The first landscape architect in this country, he came up with the term landscape architect. And was many things more than just a landscape architect. He was a journalist, a writer. He started the organization that became the Red Cross, fascinating person who traveled the South in the 1850s, so in the slavery South. And this is right before he designed Central Park and was pretty hopeless after that experience and wrote about it in ways that are hard to read, actually. But he talked a lot about the spaces he was creating, Central Park, but also responsible for Emerald Necklace in Boston and so many places that we cherish today. But his approach to it was that it was about creating this democratic space for everyone. If you read about his design, his concepts around the designs, they all had to do with, they were really for the average person that didn't have anything. It's to this point of, we're responsible for creating beautiful spaces in our city because there are people that live in our city that never get to go to Paris. So we're responsible for what they get to experience here in Atlanta. But the issue that I struggle with, so this is just a chat and I'm just bringing up things that I myself struggle with, I think we assume too much about what people want or need, and how, I guess I'm looking for perspective on well-designed places and spaces and how the people that need them are guiding that process, or, you know what I mean? Like that who am I to say how this should be designed? I don't live there, and yes, we have involvement in these things, but just on that topic of, an extension of this matter of democratic spaces is the people being involved and how they're shaped.
So that's a great question. I think first, part of the issue is that when Olmstead was working, he had to advocate for first principles because he was part of a movement that was building urban America, and kind of building what was becoming a new and different nation. And my view is that part of what's been going on in this country is that we have taken for granted this inheritance, including the inheritance of democracy itself, but also the institutions and places that we get. And so the way I interpret this last election and this period that we've been in is as an act of kind of nihilism, in which we say like we don't believe that this system has worked in the way that we want, and so a bunch of people in this country attacked the system itself and said, we want to blow this thing up. And now what we're blowing up is a lot of the institutions and values and systems that we think of when we talk about democracy. Right? That's really what's going on. So I think part of this moment is about reckoning with what it means to live in a democratic society. And I think what you're expressing is a sense that we need to come up with a compelling vision of what it would be like to live in a democratic place. And that means thinking about the democratic side of it, and also means thinking about the place side of it. So let's go to the place side of it. Once upon a time, there were big urban planning figures and developers and bigwig politicians who said, we're going to have a park here, and we're going to build a highway there. We're going to put this park here, and they did it. And that was kind of how growth happened. And for a while, it was not too hard because there weren't that many people. But once there were people, as long as the people weren't, too loud and powerful, you do it anyway. So everybody who knows about cities knows the famous story of Robert Moses and Jane Jacobs. But there were a lot of Robert Moseses who just didn't get as much attention because they weren't operating in New York City. I'm sure there was a Robert Moses figure in Atlanta who I don't know about. But the world is really different right now. It's harder to do it. It's harder to do that kind of thing. At the same time, it's not at all clear what the model is for doing more democratic planning. So for years after Superstorm Sandy hit New York, Congress passed a $50 billion disaster relief bill. And you might not know this, but one of the regulations for FEMA is that if a municipality gets FEMA funds for disaster recovery, you're not allowed to build back anything that was better than what was there before. You can only build things up to the standards from before because the federal system is skeptical about local governments taking advantage of federal money to upgrade it. Maybe that made sense in a world where there was a stable climate, but basically now what that often means is FEMA saying to cities sorry, you've got to put your power plant right on the river, and you can't build the wall any higher than 8 feet. And maybe they'll make an exception on the wall side, but we're making crazy decisions about planning for this reason. So the Obama administration came up with this idea okay, we got to find some workaround here because that doesn't make sense. They came up with this pilot program they called the Rebuild by Design competition, and they invited 148 multidisciplinary design teams, engineers, landscape architects, city planners from around the world to compete, to pitch new ideas for infrastructure. There was a couple $2 billion of public money available at the other side of the rainbow. And there were 10 finalists that were selected, some of the big major architects and landscape architects at the time. And the Obama administration asked me to be the research director for this competition. And I'm answering this way because we did a really interesting thing. And that is when we did this design competition, the teams did not compete by giving us a specific design proposal that we then judged. They competed with like a collective group statement and a bunch of resumes. They got selected. And then we had a 9-month process that involved 3 months of research, 3 months of consultation with stakeholders, hundreds of organizations, community groups, small business owners, city officials, civic organizations of all time, just massive numbers of people. And then a 3-month kind of participatory design stage where the teams had to take into consideration the research, the input from stakeholders, and the things that they were designing, and keep a conversation going the whole time. And the jury that I also sat on for this competition didn't meet to evaluate the final proposals until 9 months after the process began. It was a 9-month gestation period, right? In which no team could come from on high and say, this is what you need. And I will tell you that we did not get everything right in this process. At the end of the day, some communities lost, and all the work they put in went for nothing because there was no public money for them and they were pissed off. At the end, some of the winning proposals came out a certain way in the design phase, and then by the time they went through environmental review and final engineering, the city said, actually, it's not going to work if we slope the park this way. We've got to build it up so it looks more like a wall. And then people got pissed off. So there's still a lot of frustration. There's always losers in city planning. But what I will say is that this process that we did was far more participatory and democratic than the conventional one is. And since then, we have, this organization exists, Rebuild by Design, and we go around the world and work with cities. We're now working in Puerto Rico, we're working in a lot of different places to try to develop a process like this. It's hard, it's inefficient. If it's not managed well, it can generate conflict. But if it is managed well, it allows those conflicts that are inevitably there, right? It's not like it generates the conflict. It's sometimes these decisions about what to build become a vehicle through which conflicts that are there get expressed, right? We have a lot of underlying, I don't know if Atlanta's like this, but in the cities where I've lived, there's a lot of conflict, beneath the surface, We find an order, we find a way to kind of live, but there's always this stuff is there. And then when there's something that pops up, we jump into that, and that becomes the forum in which we make these arguments. If we plan well, if we come up with a good democratic process, we can have those conflicts in a reasonable way, And by the way, I'm not one of these people who thinks city life, we should all be best friends, We all have to be best friends with our neighbors. We all have to get along all the time. Part of living in a democratic society, especially a democratic society that's diverse and full of difference, is that we are going to disagree, right? And so the challenge for us is to disagree productively, to disagree and to disagree justly and fairly. If one team is winning every conflict, right? If one neighborhood is always getting the good stuff, if one class is always getting the good stuff, if one racial group or ethnic group is always getting the good stuff, and everyone else is losing all the time, then you're going to have a riot and a revolution, because that's not sustainable. But the goal should be reasonable disagreement and conflict in a civil society. And we are very far from that model right now. But I have much more hope for that model working in a place like Atlanta, at the local level, than I have for that working at the national level. So places like this have to be our models.
I'm going to ask one last question, or just ask for some comment on this topic, and then we can take questions from everybody here. This one has to do with technology, I guess, and how that factors in here. And I bring it up for a couple of reasons. One is that there's lots and lots of discussion now about what smart city means. Have you heard about this thing? That's why I mentioned smart cities to you. And how that conversation about smart cities relates to this, if it does at all. And then the other reason for bringing it up is that one thing that's happening in Atlanta right now is that people, surprising number of people are getting around on scooters. And to the point where we had 3 million rides on these scooters in 5 months in the city, which is a huge number. And I think it's a very good thing in the sense that it's requiring us to look at our streets differently. That it's kind of created this sense of urgency around safety that wouldn't have existed otherwise. And kind of so my point is really about the relationship of technological change and how it's affecting cities as it relates to the points in your book.
Yeah, that's great. And look, I feel like we're getting to the point with these scooters where like you need to get a helmet for walking. Because we're all moving in different ways right now. I mean, I'll tell you, like, I've been teaching my younger daughter how to cross the street in Manhattan. And one thing I've learned is like, in a way, the thing she's got to look out for more than anything else are the bikers who fly by on the bike paths, which are great. I'm all for the bike paths, but they're like, now the bikers have their way of going through. And I grew up as a pedestrian thinking about cars, and I have almost gotten run over several times by bikers who are just flying in the streets. I'm not blaming the bikers, but we don't have that sensibility worked out. So like our streetscapes are working differently, right? And so there's a smart city conversation is a tricky one. I think like there are all kinds of things that technology is going to do for us. We need to have like smarter public transit. I don't know what your system's like for telling you like when the bus is going to come or when the train's going to come, but New York is woefully behind there. So it's hard to tell as a rider in public transit, how long you have to wait for the bus. It could be 3 minutes, it could be 30 minutes. Some days the system works, some days it doesn't. Our subway system is dumb in the same way. It's like some stops will tell you how long you got to wait, some won't. So there's that kind of simple technology, which we still haven't gotten right. I think everybody's worried about privacy and tracking. And so as we move into an era where more of our lives are connected to these systems, cities are going to have to think about how to respect the interest of the citizens have in maintaining some semblance of a private life. That's an issue. But on the streetscape, I think that's a really exciting possibility. And here's an area where, like, I think to go back to what you were talking about when you said the Atlanta that's already built up, what an amazing opportunity to have these big road systems that could be converted. Like some American cities going to close down a few lanes of a highway and say we're going to have like a metropolitan biking system, or like we're going to roll out a bus rapid transit system that's different. That's like the Latin American models. It's really going to work better. We're going to charge more for cars, and we're going to use new smart technologies to have congestion pricing, and we're going to start charging people to park. Why should you get access to the city streets for free all the time, including in neighborhoods? So you're going to have to tax cars. We're not going to be able to live in a world where we can just take private vehicles anywhere. And then you're really going to have to promote the scooters and the bikes, and God knows what else we're going to develop next. Because it's not like the scooters is the last technology we're going to have for how to move on wheels in the city. We're going to come up with a whole new set of things. So it's one thing, and again, I just don't know your city all that well, but it's one thing to have bike lanes or scooter lanes. Are they separated? Are they divided off so that cars can't enter into them? Are they clearly marked so that pedestrians don't enter into them? How do you facilitate enough mobility with these new systems so that we can actually make people feel safe? In New York City, we have a huge issue right now, which is horrible levels of pedestrian fatality and also horrible levels of biker fatalities. Cars still don't know how to live with bikes, and we not perfected a system for separating the bikers from everybody else. I don't know if this is an issue in Atlanta. Maybe you got everything separated. But I'm much more interested in the challenge of getting that right. And I think there's a lot of human life at stake. Right now, I find myself as a parent in a really tough position, which is I would like to teach my kids who are 13 and 10 how to live more sustainable lives. I will never let them bicycle in Manhattan because it's too dangerous. I don't want them biking on my city streets. My office and their school is on a street that has enormous numbers of fatalities. And the only way we're going to create cities that really feel safe for the people who want a scooter, bicycle, or hoverboard, or whatever else we're gonna do next until we get our jetpacks, finally, is by really carefully planning that stuff. And I just don't see, again, I don't know what you're doing in Atlanta, but I have not seen a sufficient level of creative energy go into that project in the cities I've observed.
The one thing to bring up for me about the smart city thing, and I know there's aspects of technology that can improve the systems that we all rely upon, and the ones you mentioned specifically about public transportation are great examples, that it makes it easier and more efficient and maybe even affordable to use public transportation by how we deploy technology basically to make it easier for people. My issue with it is, and this gets to your point, is to me, it's always communicated in the context almost as though this will solve cities' problems. And what are those problems exactly? I think when I listen, which is why I think the contents of this book are so much more important in the sense that you're really talking about how we live together as people, folks. I mean, in the fact that we're not going to all agree with each other, we're not all going to like each other, but there's an aspect of this which is lifestyle. What do you expect of your city? If you expect your city to be this constellation of these private things that you're playing with, then we're in trouble. You know, and I think the smart city thing almost enables that kind of thinking, which is that there's some technological solution for these challenges that we're all facing. And maybe there is in some cases, but the basic problem is people. I mean, not problem, it's people. I mean, the issue is around people's relationships and how we share a community.
That's right. And the last thing I'll say before we jump into the bigger conversation is, I think this is going to be a hard pill to swallow, but given the reality of our climate and our need to reduce our carbon footprint, I don't see a scenario where in the future we all have access to as many private amenities, private luxuries as we take for granted. It seems to me like the way that we have to build forward is we have to build public luxuries, right? Public amenities, and find ways to share things. But I think we literally cannot, as a matter of just our carbon footprint, we're not going to be able to afford the private luxuries at the scale that we have developed for now. And we're going to have to find a way of sharing things. Yeah, but we can share things, and this is the great thing for cities, is that we can do much better on public luxuries, right? We could, and I don't know, anyone here ever been to Europe and you go to some of the old European cities and you see these like public plazas and beautiful fountains and public spaces, and you come home and you think like, wow, it felt really good to be in that place, And basically in the United States, I think our history is we have foregone public luxuries in order to get private amenities. And now we're gonna have to flip that. And I don't think that's a bad thing, right? And like, when you walk around cities, oftentimes the things that make you the happiest, the things that make you most depressed are the public luxuries.
Okay, great. Well, let's take questions from those of you here. That would be good. Enough of our stuff.
Do you want to press the mic away?
Let's start with Phil, if we could, in the back there.
I can do it that
That way also our live stream can hear you.
Thanks. So I'm Phil with Soccer in the Streets. Thanks for taking the interest in our project. I was in New York last week and was trying out different modes of transportation. Actually, biking was the quickest one for me down the West Side Trail. My question's more directed at, it seems to me technology and the ability for public infrastructure to keep up with it is completely out of sync. Technology is mostly private driven. So from scooters, from any smart technology. And I feel that certainly in Atlanta, if you've gone our Beltline here, we're part of a big social experiment on survival, given the chances of getting run over by a scooter or someone on a bike are pretty high. So how do you rectify that when the public side of stuff moves so slowly, but the private side of technology moves so fast? And what's the answer to that?
So I think it's a really tough question, because the danger you always have is you lock in infrastructure for a technology that's not going to last very long. And look, there's a lot of cities that have had to completely redo their infrastructure for food delivery, for instance, because many major cities built these big food wholesale markets for trains. And so you got these these rail lines that go into an area, and then the food system shifts from trains to trucks. And then you've got all these trucks that squeeze into an old port area, and you've got massive traffic and pollution, and next thing you have to blow the whole thing up. And so if we said, okay, the technology of the future for getting around is going to be the scooter, and we went and rebuilt every city everywhere, and then the next week, after we finished the project, the Jetson company came in and invented, the little hovercraft that we all flew around in, the jetpack, we'd feel like fools. So I think we have to figure out some way of evolving with the different modes of transit that we're developing. So I'm fairly skeptical that we're going to be flying in jetpacks anytime soon. I could be wrong about that, but I do think that we're going to have fast things moving around on wheels that are smaller than cars and that are individual, and some will be bicycles and some will be scooters and some will be something else. And I'm willing to bet that there's some pretty good ways to build in an infrastructure for that kind of personal transit on wheels that could be managed and regulated, and that could also be done in a way that would allow it to expand. So you want to be able to build systems that can be modified over time. And that's not necessarily an easy thing to do all the time, but in this case, it seems to me like it's solvable. There's a hand right in the front that went up in the very beginning, so we should let him. I think he had his hand up even before we stopped speaking, so.
I'm CJ Morris, I'm an AmeriCorps Vista with Invest Atlanta. Regarding this, you both actually have referenced this. You mentioned the model of Europe, and actually Commissioner Keane, you actually shared this a few months ago regarding shutting down Peachtree, or not shutting down Peachtree, but changing the way we use a section of Peachtree. A lot of great ideas about how we can use our spaces differently, but like we said, Atlanta is really married to its cars. And so how do you get the political will out there for things that people say they want, but then when you say, I'm going to take away your cars, for example, it may not be politically popular.
Yeah, so I'm going to let Tim handle most of this, but I'll just say a few years ago in New York City, the city planning commissioner said, Broadway, we're taking all the cars out of Broadway. There are going to be no more cars on Broadway. What? What are you talking about? It's going to be Carmageddon. I live on 15th Street, and last week 14th Street became car-free. It's a big street, 4 lanes. One of the few streets that goes east-west across all of Manhattan. It's going to be bus only. And here's an area where, at first, actually, there was not massive political will. This was top-down policy. It was controversial. And it turned out that when you instituted the changes, at least with Broadway, it did not result in massive increases in traffic because people stopped driving as much. And all these people started walking down Broadway. It became a fun thing to do. And there were all these unexpected benefits. There's a big fight in New York City that we've had for years over congestion pricing. And now we're finally about to get congestion pricing. And it's controversial because people are congestion pricing, so it's going to cost, and you get resistance from some of the people in the outer boroughs who say I'm a working class guy and I have to come to the city for work and the public transit's not good enough and so I need to drive, and why are you going to make me pay for this thing? And there are going to be tough politics on it. But my sense is that in New York, here's an area where kind of a principled commitment to a long-term sustainability goal wound up being very successful. And the kind of popular will has turned around a little bit. So now there's actually much more support for congestion pricing than there had been before. But I think it's on this case, it's cruel to say we're going to generate a bunch of policies that keep you out of your car if you don't have the adequate public transit to compensate for it. So my view is if you're going to really push policies that make it harder for people to own private cars or to drive private cars, you need to make a real investment in the quality of your public transit system. People need to move around.
Good afternoon. First off, congrats to Bill and Soccer in the Streets. I was at the East Point Station Soccer kickoff, no pun intended, on Saturday and saw firsthand the life that that small field, no bigger than this room, will breathe into those local businesses like Oz Pizza and Cupcakery. Having said that, I do want to ask a quick question. What are some practical tips or methods that citizens can implement to help change the mindset of elected officials and decision makers so that they don't see investing in minority or urban communities as social welfare, but do it in a more equitable manner? Because the disparities exist both in our public transit system, our libraries, and our parks and recreation.
I mean, I wish there were a simple answer and I could say, use these words. I can't say that. I mean, my book is an argument for this thing I call social infrastructure, and it's an argument for what we used to call public goods. It's not social welfare, it's not public welfare, it's public goods. And the argument is that it's we live in a better city, we create a better city, and we create a better society when everyone has a shot at a good life. When we invest enough in institutions that matter and the places that matter, when people have the basic resources they need to have a shot at a good life. And part of being a decent city is making sure that you don't have some neighborhoods that are hoarding all the good things and other neighborhoods that are just getting all the toxic things. And you're right, the history of urban America is a history of not just racial segregation, but of grotesque inequality, where some places had far more than they needed and too many places didn't have enough. And so I think the way to do it in a way that's non-stigmatizing is to just simply make demands for the public goods that you deserve as a citizen. So libraries, public parks, decent schools, those kinds of things. I would do it in that kind of classic language. And my experience in politics is that local organizing really matters. When you get a group of people together and they make enough noise and push the right buttons, you've got a much bigger chance of making that work than if you can't. And I say that knowing that one of the fundamental problems with inequality is that the groups that have the most also oftentimes have the most time and the most resources and the best connections, so they know how to get to those buttons. And here, I guess, last thing is leadership matters. Who you vote into office, who's your local representative, who's your mayor, who's your city planner, all that stuff really makes a big difference. So when you have a good moment and you see that the stars are aligned and they're public officials who understand your interests and are your advocates, that's a time you want to celebrate that fact for a minute, but then you want to make sure that they do everything possible while they're in office. And sometimes they want you to push them there because they can't do it on their own.
The line that I read in your book, which really shook me and I think offers me the greatest focus on how I'm going to take, the lessons that you have provided in this book and apply it to what I do, is that you say that we can address these profound challenges that we're facing, including climate change and other things, only if we establish stronger bonds with one another and develop some shared interests too. And developing shared interests is a really hard thing to do. When we have been driven apart and have wandered apart in so many ways as a society, and we have not invested in quality places for people to come together, it's a very difficult thing to do. And I've been struggling because I think this is
really the most important thing for us to understand and work on. If we care about climate change and we're not thinking about how we're bringing people together that don't spend time together to agree that we need to figure this out and do it together, then we're not going to be able to. So, other than trying to use your lessons in what I do in creating a place in Bucket, of all places, where we can bring everybody together so that we can learn to like each other and understand each other and work on these problems together. I think that's the only thing that maybe most of us can do is, as Ray Anderson said, right in the corner where you are and what if everybody did it? So I just want to thank you for your book. I want to thank you for Atlanta City Design. And I want to thank Sanjay as a surrogate for your entire organization for soccer in the streets and station soccer. But I got to tell you, when I hear the people at MARTA calling it soccer in the stations, that bothers me, and I wish that we keep it right. Thank you. There's no response necessary. I just thought it was important to say.
I want to say one thing that relates to what you just said, Jim, and it has to do with what I think of as the optimistic, hopeful aspect of Atlanta. And it involves changing people's perspective on what victory means in the sense that, and this has to do with public investments and the public places we're making, which is central to a lot of this. And there's many aspects of this, but one aspect of it is we're talking about what we think of our public spaces and places and how we make those and what does success look like? What is the victory here? And my feeling about Atlanta, and it's not just a city, but this bigger place, is that we have thought of reducing traffic congestion to a phenomenal degree as the victory that we're seeking. That is, I mean, we're investing, we're still investing way more. We're investing a ridiculous amount more in trying to achieve that victory than we are in anything that we're discussing here. And it's sad because it's so hopeless. That is a hopeless endeavor. And this is a public service announcement. That's never happened in a city. A city that thinks of that as their victory has never had success, has never been satisfied. It's often, we are typically, the city of Atlanta is in the top 10 of cities in the world in traffic congestion. Traffic congestion, and we tend to be between London and Paris. If you actually look at these lists, which is interesting in the sense that they have terrible congestion, we have terrible congestion. The thing is that they have a city, and we don't. I mean, they have a city, and they got congestion. We got congestion, and what a hopeful thing it would be if we could say victory is beautiful spaces for people in the city to share. That's victory. And we're going to invest everything we have in that. You know what? We can do that. We can never have this fantasy victory about congestion. Such a thing doesn't exist, but we can remake our streets. What an amazing thing for this city. Because we have, and your point, you've got these massive spaces that can be remade. If we can only, it's to everybody's points here about how do you get these things done, is when we say that's victory to us. And anybody that's in charge of anything in this city has to know that. We don't give a damn about congestion. We want a city. Help us with that. I have an opinion about that, you didn't notice.
Hello, my name is Doug Joyner, and I look at this from the perspective of children as commuters, locally, regionally, nationally. That doesn't happen. There have been transportation plans written for this region and for the city. And children, the word children doesn't rarely exist in the documents, so consequently, planning for children doesn't really exist. And I look at it from the health and safety perspective. And I guess I come to the question that, the theme is real simple. Adults need to talk about what children do. We do it as parents, planners, engineers, administrators, in city, school system personnel don't communicate around children. They communicate around buildings, land, and money. But children have to be served by both. So my question becomes, what will it take? Because the death of children isn't working. That doesn't get it. Especially in low-income minority communities. What will it take to create a cultural shift in this country, in this city, like they have in Brazil, the 150 child-friendly cities that exist in UNICEF? What would it take for a place like Atlanta to make a cultural shift? Not only looking at children, but also engaging children in the process.
To be honest and to be fair, I think the best way to answer that is just to not answer it and ask all of us to think about that. Because of course nobody in this room can tell you that. But you're asking us to take seriously something that we're failing to address. So I'm going to just hear you. And I hear you making an indictment, which is that we have failed in our ordinary policy discourse to let things that should register as emergencies do that.
Georgia State public policy students in 2017 looked at children as commuters. And the disparity in the resilience of the health and protection of children, and found a program that works. We call it Children as Commuters. We have a second round of Georgia Tech students from public policy and also from civil and environmental engineering, taking a closer look at the design. And so there's a program that's been working on the ground. How does that, I guess I'm asking, how does that get into, because I don't do politics, how does that get into the right minds, the right places?
Yeah, so I take your question. I mean, I don't mean to avoid your question. I think your question is not a question that asks for a simple answer, right? Your question is an indictment of a society that's failed to take seriously its children's health and well-being. And you are talking about commuters. You know, we obviously need to talk about this in terms of gun violence as well. I mean, the experience of being a parent in the United States and have your kids come home and tell you about the drill they did in school for a mass shooting.
This is just the fire drills, not the shooting drills.
You know, we're subjecting our children to extraordinary amounts of pressure and anxiety and stress, you know. So guns, commuting, climate change, you know, you pick your living with this technology. You know, it's a marker of decent society that we take our children's moral lives seriously. And I think we're failing children. So, sorry, I just want to be clear. I think you're asking a terrific question, and I think it would be wrong for me to say, you know, here's the point. Did you want to say something?
I want to say something. It makes me think about station soccer again, in the sense that, and Phil and Sanjay could talk about this at great length, that an aspect of this station soccer matter are the transit stations. In thinking of children's mobility and how they're getting around safely and in a congenial way, that aspect of it, creating these soccer villages around the stations. The station is the thing. It's the field and soccer, but it's the station. And could we ask that of our public schools to be thinking in such ways? And the other investments we make publicly, that it isn't that this is a small thing, it's central to the decisions around where we put things, that it connects us through these other investments we're making.
So I don't know how we stand. I want to stick around and sign books and have a few conversations. I've got a flight at 4:30, and I want to make this the first of many future visits to Atlanta. So I hope we can continue the conversation. I understand that if the Atlanta United does really well, it has a chance of playing the NYCFC team. So we might come back for a rematch with you guys, and that'll provide an occasion for a good visit. I really appreciate you being here at lunchtime. It's a busy time. I know a lot of you have a lot of stuff going on, and it means a lot to me that so many people came for this terrific conversation. Again, Stephanie and Sanjay, thank you for a great visit, and Tim, it's really an honor that you took some time with me. So let's hope for some future conversations, and that next time I come here, there's no more traffic, and all children ride the subway for free.
I should got paid. And I had no idea you were talking about the Is it about what happened? Really good.